Hello, and thanks for checking out my presentation on the EUSIPCO 2025 Phased Array Signal Processing Student Challenge. I'm Matias Mikkonen, and I represent the Finnish Geospatial Research Institute as an assistant research scientist, and I'm also a student at Aalto University in Finland. My teammates for this challenge were Professor Zahidul Bhuiyan of the FGI, Dr. Daniele Borjo of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and Mr. Veli Hytönen, who is also a student at Aalto University. Now, to begin with the presentation, I will first introduce you to the outline of my presentation. We will begin with an introduction to the challenge scenario and objectives. Before moving on to the results themselves, we will begin with jamming characterization and detection, before moving on to direction finding of the jamming signal and mitigation of the effects of the jamming. Whenever applicable, I will try to point out relevant references so as to keep this presentation quite concise. In any case, the challenge scenario comprises a uniform rectangular GNSS reception array with 4 elements. The dataset begins with clean data, however, a noise-like jamming signal increases in power over time in the background. The objectives of the challenge are then to determine the precise start time of the jamming action and to determine the direction of arrival of the jamming signal, while at the same time mitigating the effects of the jamming. Now, moving on to the first subtopic, I will quickly present what we achieved in terms of jamming signal characterization. The results you are seeing on this slide were obtained at the very end of the dataset, where the jamming signal is at its highest power. So that is to say, this type of characterization may not be possible for signals with a particularly low power, for example. But in this case, autocorrelation analysis revealed the jamming signal to be a repeating PRN sequence with a period of 1/3 milliseconds. And then the PSD analysis, a very simple PSD analysis, indicates a one-sided bandwidth of approximately 3 MHz. Further time domain analysis allowed us to estimate the individual data bits of the transmitted PRN sequence. And as we will see later, this has quite nice implications for the detection of the jamming. Very well. Now onto the first actual challenge objective. For jamming detection, we considered 2 distinct techniques. The G-square test developed at FGI observes the baseband sample amplitude distribution in real time, and it detects many different types of interfering signals as soon as they are above the noise floor in power. And now, since we have 4 antennas, we can take the individual CST metrics from the processing chains, and then we can, for example, take a median. And we found that this allowed us to lower the detection threshold while keeping the same probability of false alarm. And as you can see from the figure on the right-hand side of the slide, the CST triggers real-time detection for this dataset at approximately 3 minutes and 6 seconds past 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of testing. The model-based approach was implemented in addition to the real-time technique by modifying conventional GNSS tracking and acquisition loops to operate with the PRN sequence that we obtained for the jamming signal. As noted earlier, this approach is only possible if the jamming signal, first of all, has a suitable structure, and secondly, is high enough in power, so that we can actually estimate this structure. Now, in this case, it is possible, and we do obtain quite a nice result. As you can see in the right-hand side image as well, the jamming signal is detectable since the very beginning of the dataset with the model-based approach. The second challenge objective is that of direction finding. For direction finding, we consider 3 distinct techniques. Estimators based on the conventional beamformer and music algorithm converge on the same values for both the azimuth and elevation estimates as soon as the jamming signal is above the noise floor in power. And similarly to detection, we also implemented a post-correlation, post-processing technique that allowed us to confirm their elevation and azimuth estimates since the very beginning of the dataset. Now I will take a second to introduce the reference frame in which these direction of arrival results are presented. So our chosen reference frame places each antenna element in the quadrant indicated by its number, as you can see on the image on the right. Next, we wanted to present the results with respect to a physical reference. To do this, we obtained an estimate of the direction of true north in our chosen reference frame by performing direction of arrival analysis on the GNSS satellite signals. For more details, I encourage you to have a look at the article I have mentioned on the bottom of the slides. In any case, now since we do have an estimate of the jamming direction of arrival in our chosen reference frame and an estimate of true north in the same reference frame, we can present the results we obtained on a map. So what we have done here is we have kept the jamming direction of arrival fixed with respect to our north estimate, and then we have simply aligned our north estimate with true north in Google Earth. And just for reference, we have obtained the true jammer location from the jammer test catalog. And now on to the third and final objective of the challenge, that is jamming mitigation. A common array processing technique for interference mitigation is to minimize the overall array output power. And our first mitigation technique is based on the conventional beamformer. And essentially, by allowing only a variable phase shift to each of the array signals before summation, before forming the array output, we are essentially limiting ourselves to choosing main beam steering angles. The idea here is that a single interference source is likely to fall into a null region for at least some steering angle. This approach will be useful if the same steering angle also permits acceptable reception of the GNSS signals. And since we now have such a small array with only 4 elements, it will be associated with quite a wide main beam that will allow reception from a large set of spatial directions around the main beam steering direction. And we have been calling this technique blind steering in the experimentation. And as I mentioned, power minimization is a common and well-known array processing technique, and as such, there are much more formal techniques available. And the minimum variance beamformer is a classical power minimization technique that adaptively minimizes the output power of the antenna array, and it does so by leveraging both the phase shifts and magnitudes of the signals before summation. In minimum variance beamforming, we usually set a constraining steering vector that defines the desired array factor. But in this case, since we don't exactly know what the best steering vector would be for optimal GNSS signal reception from all of the available satellites, we have gone with a slight variation of classical minimum variance beamforming. This approach is known as the power inversion beamformer, which is obtained by setting the desired array factor to emulate that of a single element. That is, the elements of the steering vector will be all zeros except for 1, which is set to 1. This results in a beamformer that will indeed emulate the performance of a single element in nominal conditions and then adaptively place nulls towards interferers. Of course, this is not the whole story, and there is a lot more to be said about GNSS and blind beamformers, but unfortunately that would be a very, very long presentation. And now to the final jamming mitigation results. We concluded that the best way to demonstrate mitigation of GNSS interference would be to do so at the navigation layer. In this table, we are presenting various performance metrics, but I of course draw your attention to the availability metrics, which for both of the array processing techniques and both of the considered constellations, namely GPS and Galileo, are 100%. PNT processing here was implemented in the open source software receiver FGI GSRX, which was developed and is maintained by the Finnish Geospatial Research Institute. Note also that no performance is lost against a single antenna solution in the nominal section. This will be a little bit more clear on the next and final slide. Here on the right-hand side of this final slide, you can see the horizontal RMS error for each of the considered constellations over time. Furthermore, we are comparing for both the constellations, both of the array processing techniques against the single antenna solution. And as you can see in the image, the vertical dashed lines indicate the timestamps at which the fixed GPS or Galileo fix was lost for the single antenna solutions. And it's quite clear that the array processing techniques can sustain a far higher level of interference than just the single antenna solution. And now to draw some final conclusions, our primary observation is, of course, that phased array signal processing has significant potential for resilient PNT. And supporting this fact are some regulatory reforms that have taken place very lately. In particular, controlled radiation pattern antennas that are in particular meant for civilian resilient PNT purposes have been removed from the United States munitions list starting 15th of September this ongoing year. And the intention of these reforms is indeed to facilitate easier adaptation of this technology in safety-critical civilian applications. And finally, future work from our side towards this goal is intended to include, among other things, implementation of these and perhaps some other phased array signal processing techniques in the open source software receiver FGI GSRX. Many thanks again for your interest. In case you wish to learn more about the techniques that we have implemented, or if you just want to read the report for any other reason, you can download it from the link at the very bottom of the slide. And if you would like to discuss the capabilities, performance, or even limitations of these techniques, you can also reach me via the email address that is on the slide. Thank you very much.